Without fighting last night, Shakur Stevenson proved he's the best 140-pound fighter. And that's a very weird thing to have happen, but I think he did. Let's get into it in this video. If you like my opinions, how cool I look and all that stuff, which I'm sure you do, subscribe to the channel, leave comments, especially if you don't like the audio. I've heard that's a thing people might comment on. And, hit the thumbs up and all that stuff so I can get engagement. Let's get into the video. So last night was supposed to be a medley of junior welterweight fights. We were supposed to see two belt holders fighting. We had a contender bout at this division. We were supposed to see Richardson Hitchens against Oscar Duarte, Gary Antoine Dutt Russell versus Andy, I can't pronounce Andy's last name, and then Nahir Albright and Frank Martin. What ended up happening was a lot of different things. And I think that it shows, first off, the difficulty in activity in different ways. When you're inactive, in Gary Antoine Russell's case, it's hard to kind of keep up momentum, I think for Andy, he came over the week of the fight and made weight professionally and gave Antoine Russell a hard fight. One has to wonder if he got over on fight week or before fight week, how that fight might have played out. But for Antoine Russell, you can see my pre-fight, I thought it was going to be a knockout of the year type performance. There are limitations with his style that we saw, where physical fighters who have some ability, his power alone is not going to overtake a fight. And the punch volume, especially in the second half of this fight, was not what you want to see or what I want to see in a championship level fight. So you have to wonder, there's another stage to development with him, at least in my perception. He's a quality fighter, 2016 Olympian. He's a world champion level fighter, but now it still seems like there needs to be a little bit more growth to be that all-time great or Hall of Fame level fighter, because this fight got very competitive towards the second half of the fight. And it's hard for me to not separate, okay, Andy came in the week of the fight, missed the press conference, and was competitive with you. First off, hell of a fighter, and credit to him. But second off, how was this fight that competitive, given that you had such a massive just advantage in terms of no jet lag, etc.? Strange, right? You can't separate that. And then you start to wonder, his best performance recently was against Jose Valenzuela. Valenzuela won a title at that division. He loses it to him, but then immediately goes down to lightweight and told me in an interview with Boxing Scene that he felt too small at the division. So I start to wonder, how does his style match with these big physical guys at the division? You start to wonder, and then you look at guys like Shakur Stevenson, a master of distance. How is he going to be able to impose that will on guys when in that second half of the fight, Andy was having an issue with him? Then we had Richardson Hitchens, who I'm incredibly high on. I think he's the dark horse of the division. Unable to compete. Falls ill day of the fight, out of his fight with Oscar Duarte. People have strong opinions on this. I think for Hitchens, there's a troubling trend that feels like it's always one thing or another with him. And I tend to take the fighter's side in these instances. I think a lot of people were very excited about this because stylistically, this fight answered questions about Hitchens from the Gustavo Lamos fight. The Gustavo Lamos fight was a fight where Hitchens looked underwhelming, to be perfectly honest, and he got bullied at times. I still think he won, but it didn't look like a championship level performance, to say the least. And I think people wanted to see, could Duarte do the same thing, because they viewed him as a higher level fighter. Robert Garcia is probably the top-notch trainer right now. He's like, I keep saying, he's like the Cus D'Amato. And they wanted to see how that matchup would go. And I think people put their emotion into it and the frustration. It's getting to the point, though, if the IBF rehydration, he made the IBF rehydration, and then there was, the team said food poisoning, I believe, or fell ill to a certain effect. You have to start to wonder, is he a welterweight? He's a big guy for this weight class, and you miss out on a huge opportunity here. Welterweight's an interesting division full of new players. maybe it's time to leave this division. Maybe it's time for a guy like Hitchens to enter into a new weight class. And for Duarte, it's disappointing, right? Because it looked like he was in tip-top shape. It looked like he was emotionally ready to go. And who knows? You only get so many chances to be in the absolute best shape of your life. And for him, it looked like he physically and mentally was prepared to have the best night of his career. Do you replicate that again? Even if he fights again in, like, say, May or whenever, March, April, pick a month, do you get back to that? Or do you have like what I call it athlete depression, where like you're like, man, I didn't get to fight. And even though you try to go through the motions, you just can't quite get back to the same spot. So that position's in flux. The biggest threat in the division is Dalton Smith. And Dalton Smith had probably one of the biggest British wins coming over to the U.S. to defeat Subriel Matias. That said, we haven't seen the sustained longevity of Smith, but Smith versus Shakur Stevenson now becomes the most interesting fight in the division by default with the recent performances. The big takeaway I see from this night of action, and I haven't even touched on one other fight, is when fighters are active, you get to see where they are, for better or for worse. So some fighters sharpen, and then when you see fighters in competitive matchups and good fights, you get to assess where they're really at. And sometimes that, where they're at is where they're at, and it might not be where you perceived it. Finally, Frank Martin versus Nahir Albright. Frank's had a lot of fights at or around the 140-pound weight class throughout his career. Nahir Albright's made a career out of spoiling guys. He's beat Michael Dutch over. He's beat Carlos Balderos. He's beaten Kelvin Davis most recently, and now he comes in, almost beats Frank Martin. And I think the thing with Frank Martin is, and I talked about this in the Ryan Garcia video, I think people thought he looked really sharp, which he did against Francis Barthélemy, but there was an age factor, I think. It's a 40-year-old guy who couldn't do the same things. And now, not unlike maybe Ryan Garcia, Mario Barrios, you have someone who had limited athletic gifts, and now you go in with Nahir Albright, who can match him athletically, maybe even match him intellectually, but maybe doesn't quite have the same gears. Or maybe he showed he did have the same gears. He just hasn't been promoted the same way, or whatever's happened. And you see a competitive fight. And what I think this showed was one thing. I think that Frank's legs are going to be different. Not working with Derek James, he felt more in the pocket, more stationary. He's not moving as much. And I also think that there's like styles make fights, and certain matchups are going to lead people to overrate things. And that's what we learned from this weekend. So Russell's win over Valenzuela was a great stylistic matchup for Russell. He was physically imposing. Martin's win over Barthélemy was a great matchup for Martin. These are good matchups that lead to perceptions. But after this weekend, some competitive fights, without even fighting, Shakur Stevenson looks like he's above the rest.